Well, hello and welcome to our study of the book of Acts. We are picking up this evening in Acts chapter 22. Well, actually, we're going to pick up in the very last verse of Acts chapter 21 and then move into Acts chapter 22. Got a couple of fellows joining me here, Brother Michael Valenzuela and one of our elders at Pepper Road, Lance Alexander, and I'm Brad Collins. And we're going to pick up in our study of the book of Acts, as I say here, very last verse of Acts chapter 21. To give you a quick rundown of how we got here, in the last chapter, Paul was on his way back on the last leg, really, of his third missionary journey. He was on his way to Jerusalem. When he made it to Jerusalem, in an effort to try to deal with some false rumors that had been circulating about him, he went to help some fellow Jews fulfill their vows at the temple. But there were unbelieving Jews who recognized him from Asia, and they really just made up false allegations against him, saying that he had brought Gentiles into the temple and defiled it. Well, that got the whole city stirred up, and they laid hands on Paul. They started to beat him, would have killed him, except for the Roman garrison that was right near the temple there. The commander rushed in and rescued Paul, and was hoping to find out who this fellow was and what in the world he could possibly have done to cause such an uproar. And Paul said, listen, could you let me speak to the crowd? And the commander gave him leave to do so. And that's where we pick up here, very last verse of Acts chapter 21. And we're going to see Paul's address to the people here. Well, we're going to take these questions round robin. And the first couple of questions Michael's going to take for us. So questions 1 and 2, Michael, how did Paul address the crowd? And then why did the crowd give him their full attention when he started to talk?
To answer your first question, as you kind of led into it, is he's standing on a set of stairs, bloody, beaten, having just begged the tribune to give him a chance to speak. So I think to start there is to realize that Paul's not got an audience, that he's with everybody. He's even begging the person that he has a chance to get a chance to speak. So he didn't even have necessarily the opportunity here to do so. But you think about him standing on a set of steps after just being beaten, just dragged out of a city, motioning with his hands to get them to just be a little quiet, and then really just waiting for them to listen. And so you can kind of get that sense. And then you get to chapter 21. He says, brothers and fathers, hear the defense that I now make before you. And that word defense there has that connotation of a reasoned defense, like a legal kind of term that brings about the, much as we've seen Paul rationalize or reason with those who he's addressing. In my setting, I probably would have tried to get my 1 pound of flesh in that moment, whereas Paul is always seeking to teach the gospel. And so to answer your first question, he's showing really love and to his enemies in that sense. And he's wanting to give them actual evidence, as we'll see going through this text. And then to your second question, why did the crowd grow silent and give Paul their attention? Reading verse 20 or chapter 22, verse 2. And when they heard that he was addressing them in the Hebrew language, they became even more quiet. And he said, and we'll get into that here in just a second. But just at the very end of the last passage, he's speaking Greek to the Roman tribune, and now he's showing he's bilingual by speaking Hebrew or Aramaic, either way, to those that are there that are Jews. So he gets them to quiet down even further by approaching them with the language they understand.
Yeah. I didn't get into all of the charges really that they had made against him, but the Jews who recognized him, the Jews who were from Asia, they said, well, he's teaching against this holy place, and he's telling the Jews in other places not to follow the customs of our fathers and to abandon circumcision. A man who was a rebel against the Jews and who was trying to overturn those customs. You can imagine that that sort of fellow would want to stick a finger in the eye of the Jews.
Yeah.
And so he would address them in Greek, but no, he does not do that. He addresses them in the language that they know, the language of that land. And as you said, he calls them brethren and fathers. He is not trying to pick a fight with them. He's trying to do everything he can to appeal to them. And keep an eye out for that sort of thing. We're going to see that all through this passage as we examine his speech here. Well, as he continues, or really gets into the meat of what he's about to say, Lance, in question number 3 here, why did Paul begin his address with details of his background before his conversion to Christianity?
Well, as we've already mentioned, he presents his defense to the people there that's in Jerusalem. And so his primary purpose at the beginning of that defense is to say, I am a Jew. I am a Jew. I was born in Tarsus, and I was brought up here in Jerusalem. And not only that, but he was brought up under the wing of Gamaliel, which we'll talk about in a few minutes a little more. But he was a very prestigious man in the court that was very well known. And Paul also makes the point that he was a devout Jew, and he also was contrary to this very way that he's preaching right now. He was against that. He was against it to a point he was killing people. He was putting people to death. He was going house to house. And I think it's interesting, he says, putting women and men in prison, not just men, but women as well. So, I mean, he was very devoted and very zealous in going against this way. And these were the same kind of feelings these people were having. They felt like he was teaching against this law, but he's like, I'm a Jew. I follow that law. I'm a Jew and I'm preaching this. So that's the purpose of he was telling the people that.
Yeah, and in fact, I dare say that he's trying to present to them. Look, I was once where you are. I persecuted this way, and of course we'll see a change that he tells them about. But he's showing them I can relate to where you're coming from. I know why you think what you think and why you're trying to do what you're trying to do. But let me have a word with you to try to convince you. Again, nothing in any of this that shows any sort of animosity toward the Jewish customs or toward the temple or toward the law. Still very deferential to all that. Well, question number 4 here is, Lance mentioned Gamaliel. Well, who was Gamaliel? We've actually met him before in Acts. Luke, way back in Acts chapter 5, when Peter and John and the other apostles were brought before the Sanhedrin. As the Sanhedrin were questioning them, Gamaliel, again, a respected member of that body, had them put out so that he could have a word with his fellow members on the court. And the way Luke described him was he was one of the council, and he was a teacher of the law held in respect by all the people. So this was not some Johnny-come-lately. This was not somebody who held sway with certain factions, but rather everybody respected this man. And Paul says, I was this man's student. I tried to follow in his ways. He was also the fellow who, if you recall, advised his fellow council members, now listen, be careful how you handle this, because we've seen some cases where we've had some people who were a little full of themselves, think that they were some sort of a savior, and they died, and their little movements fizzled out. No problem. But if this is actually from God, you can't stop it. And you don't want to find yourselves fighting against God. A great deal of wisdom that Gamaliel, I think, exercised and urged his fellow council members to abide by. Now, we don't know what happened to Gamaliel. We have these 2 mentions. Now, secular history says that he died. This is about the year 58 when Paul is making this defense. Secular history says that he died a few years before that. And there's even some church tradition that he may have been converted. No idea. but regardless, he was not a stupid man, and he was not a man who was not well respected. Paul's saying, I'm one of you. I was brought up according to the strictest tradition of all of you by one of your most respected teachers. Well, Michael, when he's telling the story of his conversion, now we're not going to get into all of the details of the story of his conversion because, or rather I should say his trip to Damascus, because we covered that back in Acts chapter 9 when Luke originally related that portion of the story to us. But if we're reading closely, we see something that looks like it could be a contradiction. Back in Acts chapter 9, as Luke is relating the account, he says that the men who were accompanying Paul to Damascus, when that light appeared and they all fell to the ground, it said that they heard a voice, but they saw no one. But then here, as Paul is giving this account personally, he says they didn't hear the voice of the one who spoke. So wait a second, what's going on here? Are Luke and Paul somehow at odds? Did Paul forget the story and tell it wrong? What's going on here?
Well, if you look at some of the versions of the Bible, some of the translations, you'll find that slight discrepancy. But I think the point still is driven home by the context that's there. And second to that is if you look at some of the new manuscript or some of the translations that are using a little bit more of the documents that have been found along the way. Like I use the English Standard Version a lot.
Mm-hmm.
It says in verse 9, now those who were with him or were with me saw the light, but did not understand the voice. So it's not that there's a discrepancy, but as much as clarification that's made in some of the newer manuscripts or some of the manuscripts that are found at a later date that go back a little further. And if you look at like the New American Standard Version, it has the same thing there, but did not understand the voice. So you look back at like King James, New King James, and those along that side, it'll say what you're saying there, did not hear the voice. But what that's really kind of saying is they didn't hear what was said. And to that point is, that's not the first time that we've come across that through the Bible story either, where a message is given and not everybody hears the message, not everybody heeds the message. And so I think that kind of maybe ties back in with a broader theme through the scripture.
Yeah. It turns out that the Greeks used the word "hear" the same way we do in English. Maybe I'm back here in the back of the house, and my wife hollers at me from a different end of the house, and I say, "What was that, Hannah? I didn't hear you." Well, obviously I heard her voice, but I didn't hear her in the sense of understanding what she had to say. Versus if you have the town crier stand up and say, hear ye, he doesn't just mean note the fact that I'm speaking. He means I want you to understand what I'm saying. So we use the term that way. The Greeks did too. Now, something that the Greeks had that we did not is they had a way of indicating with the inflection of or maybe it's the declension of the noun. I forget the right term there, but basically if you use the verb here with the Greek noun, whatever it was that it was taking as its object, if you used the object in its what's called its genitive case, then that meant that, let me get it right here. If you use the genitive case, which is what Acts 9 uses, to hear means to hear the sound of, but not necessarily to understand. But then in Acts 22, verse 9, that uses the word "hear" with these fellows who were hearing. It uses the noun in the accusative case, and that means to hear with the understanding. So what we have here is in Acts chapter 9, Luke using the Greek that says they heard, but they didn't necessarily understand. But then in Acts chapter 22, Paul uses the Greek that says that they did not hear with understanding. So there really is no contradiction there at all. And if we absolutely have to, we can go to Greek to find that out. Now, I will say that even though we know now that there's no contradiction, in one place it says they heard, but not necessarily with understanding. And in another place, it said they did not hear with understanding. There's no contradiction there. Luke doesn't tell us why, though. So why did they not understand? And I put in the question a reference to Acts 26, verse 14. That's where Paul, he's going to give this account again. And he says that the voice speaking to him was in the Hebrew language. Now, it may be, I'll have to admit, I don't find it that likely, but it may be that the fellows who were with him did not understand Hebrew. You would think, though, that if Paul has some fellows going with him to Damascus for the purpose, number one, under orders from the high priest, the Jewish high priest in Jerusalem, and they're under orders to bring back Christians to Jerusalem to be tried, you would think that those folks are probably themselves from Judea or Jerusalem, and so they probably understand Aramaic. So I don't find that particularly compelling. However, I suppose it's possible that these guys were Grecian or Hellenistic Jews who did not speak Aramaic as well, or maybe they were some hired Roman hands. I don't know. So it's possible that they did not understand the language that Jesus spoke to Paul, but I'll have to admit that I don't find that to be the most compelling case. More likely, as you said, we have a similar case over in John where God speaks to Jesus audibly for everybody to hear from heaven. And this is John 12 and verses 28, 29. It says, the crowd that stood there and heard it said that it had thundered. God very clearly spoke to Jesus. And yet, for whatever reason, because they just weren't paying attention, or because they didn't really want to believe that God had spoken from heaven, they said, oh, no, it thundered. So that's probably what's going on. I will say that there's a third possibility. This could just be miraculous. Jesus wanted Paul to hear what he said and understand what he said. And so that's what Paul heard. Jesus wanted the fellows around Paul not to understand what he said, but to realize that somebody was talking to Paul. And so that's all that they heard. But
Right.
the point is, Luke doesn't give us enough information, I don't think, to come to a firm conclusion as to why, but he does make it clear that there's no contradiction. These men did hear a sound, they heard a voice, but they did not understand what was being said. Well, all right. As Paul continues to talk about, or through this account of his conversion, of course, he talks about not being able to see because of the brightness of the light. And then he talks about this fellow Ananias, who's going to come and tell Paul why this has happened to him. But he describes Ananias in a certain way here. Paul, how does he describe him, and why do you think he describes him the way that he does?
All right, so in chapter 22, verse 12, it says, and a certain Ananias, a man who was devout by the standard of the law and well spoken of by all the Jews who lived there. So this man was a devout Jew according to the law, and he had a very high standard and was spoken well of by all the Jews in the area of Damascus. So his point being that he wanted them to understand that this man was a Jew. He was following the Jewish law. He was doing things Jews did in regards to God's law. But yet Christ spoke to him directly back in chapter 5 and said, Ananias, I want you to go and deal with Saul at the time. So those words came from Jesus Christ himself, telling him to go and put this man to work. Mm-hmm. And Paul was using this man being a Jew, a devout Jew, a well-known Jew, and he also was able to do things for Jesus Christ. So there was no conflict there in regards to him being a Jew and also following what Christ was telling him to do.
Yeah. So let's review the things that we've seen so far. Paul's talked about his own upbringing and how not only is he a Jew by blood, but he was brought up at the feet of one of their most respected teachers there in Jerusalem. And now this fellow who comes to, at the bidding of Jesus of Nazareth, he comes to give Paul instructions. Paul says he's a devout man according to the law. He's held in high esteem by the Jews there. And I'll point out one more thing. Well, how does he address Paul? He says, Brother Saul. So this man who is held in high regard and who is so devout, he calls Paul brother. Now, I think that's brother in the sense of, a brother by blood. He was a fellow Jew. I don't think we're talking at this point that they're both Christians yet at this point in the account. But he still refers to Paul in that familial sense. So Ananias, even though this man has been a murderer of Christians, or at least had his hand in having them put to death, he calls him brother. So again, Paul's continuing to lay the groundwork and make the case, I am one of you. I do not hold any of you in contempt or hold any animosity toward you. Well, as he continues relating what Ananias said to him, look at how Ananias, our next question is, how did Ananias refer to God, and why is this detail important in Paul's address? So you've mentioned already, Lance, that Jesus had sent Ananias, this faithful Jew held in high esteem by other Jews. Well, look at how he refers to God when he is about to tell Paul his instructions. He says, this is in verse 14. Then he said, that Ananias said, the God of our fathers has chosen you. The God of our fathers, not some pagan God, the God of our fathers, the God that these Jews who had just moments ago been trying to kill Paul, the God that they knew, the God who created heaven and earth, who had called Abram out of Ur of the Chaldeans, who had given Jacob 12 sons and caused them to multiply so that they became 12 tribes, who delivered Israel out of Egypt and led them by his angel in the wilderness, who gave them a law under Moses at Mount Sinai, who gave them the land of Canaan under Joshua, who set up David and Solomon as their kings and gave them a magnificent temple, who drove Israel into captivity because of their disobedience, but then brought them back 70 years later, and spoke to countless prophets throughout those ages. That same God that they knew is now giving instructions to Paul. Okay, I think that's very important, that part of the case that Paul is laying out here. Well, Paul continues. Ananias doesn't just say, Paul, or Saul rather, God has chosen you, but what does he say that he has chosen Paul for?
Well, now, as you continue on from where you left off at verse 14, the God of our fathers appointed you to know his will, to see the righteous one, and to hear a voice from his mouth. For you will be a witness for him to everyone of what you have seen and heard. So it's kind of a long mouthful of things that he was appointed for, but in a nutshell, God has a special task in store for him to get onto. And you think, as you're starting to read through that, you start thinking about things that were mentioned otherwise in either New Testament, Old Testament. You think about how Jeremiah is quoted in Hebrews chapter 8 of, I will put my laws into their minds, and they shall not teach them, one each to his neighbor or one to his brother, know the Lord, for they all shall know me, from the least to the greatest of them. So you think about Paul kind of embodying that, if you will, as he takes on this charge. You think about him seeing the righteous one, and his account to the Corinthians, he's that one that he notes himself as the one born out of due time, and hearing a voice from his mouth. I mean, here's Paul, like you were mentioning just a minute ago, here's the God of our fathers who is addressing him, and he really, in a way, just tells him to go see Ananias. Ananias is going to tell you exactly what needs to be done, which we see that case throughout the book of Acts as well. Mm-hmm. So there's a special task in store for Paul, and really that last passage in verse 15, for you're going to be a witness to everyone, that shows that non-partiality that Paul's not necessarily ready for. You think about Saul, a guy with a PhD, if you will, in the Old Testament, a guy that had everything that was maybe even the envy of all the other Jews in a lot of ways, sitting at the feet of Gamaliel. He loses all of that to go talk to what they would have considered as dogs, mm-hmm. and teach them about the gospel. And he's going to, I'm looking ahead. That's going to be the hinge point for what happens later on in the book. So, or in this text here.
Yeah. I'll throw out too that when you look at this language, he has chosen you to know his will, to see the just one. That is to say, to see Jesus, the risen Lord, to hear the voice of his mouth, and to be his witness to all men. Sounds a whole lot like the charge that Jesus gave to the apostles, the original 12. back in Acts chapter 1, right? And so I just want to go ahead and point that out so that we note the evidence that continues to mount for the case that Paul himself was an apostle. I mean, I know we've essentially, I've taught the class basically with the assumption that everybody in class knows that and already agrees to it. But I like to note these bits of evidence as we encounter them. Paul has worked unusual miracles back in chapter 19, similar kind of thing that we saw said of Peter in chapter 5, working some unusual miracles. Paul has imparted the Holy Spirit to believers in chapter 19 also. We saw Peter and John and nobody else doing the same sort of thing back in Acts chapter 8. Luke's account in Acts chapter 9, when Jesus is sending Ananias to Paul, or Saul as he was known at the time, Jesus says of Saul, he is a chosen vessel of mine. And then finally we have Paul confirming, or rather Ananias confirming, that Paul's duty was to be the very same as the 12 apostles were given in Acts chapter 1. They are to be a witness to Jesus. And as you said, not just to fellow Jews, but to everybody. So this is a divine charge, and Paul is fulfilling a special office that very other few men hold. Well, as we continue through Ananias's instructions for Paul here in question number 9, according to Ananias, Lance, what would wash away Paul's sins?
Well, the short answer is baptism.
Mm-hmm.
But I want us to look a little closer at verse 16 and see that there's more to it than that. The first thing he says is, now why do you delay? Indicating that this is something that needs to be done immediately. There's no waiting for this. This is something that needs to be done now. Arise means you got to get up and you got something to do. You got to get busy. And that busy was to go and become a Christian by being baptized and having his sins washed away. And we see through many examples in Acts of conversions that took place, baptism is a key part of those conversions for those people to be saved. And the same situation here when Paul is reiterating this. That's what Ananias told him to do. That's what he needed to do. And he gets up and he's baptized, calling on the name of the Lord, because he's got work to do for the Lord.
Yeah. I wonder too if one of the reasons that Paul, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that he's making this up, but I wonder if one of the reasons that he mentions this detail, calling on the name of the Lord. Now, the Jews would have been familiar with baptism from their own ceremonial washings and from the activity of John the Baptist, and even Jesus when he was alive, they were baptizing folks. So that would have been old hat in a sense. Should not have been offensive at all. But the way Ananias couples this with calling on the name of the Lord, that's a phrase that appeared more than once in the Old Testament. Psalm 116, verse 17, I will offer to you the sacrifice of thanksgiving and will call upon the name of the Lord. One we're all pretty familiar with. In fact, Peter quoted it back in Acts chapter 2. From Joel chapter 2 in verse 32, it shall come to pass that whoever calls on the name of the Lord shall be saved. And then another place in Zephaniah chapter 3 verse 9, Zephaniah chapter 3 verse 9, God speaking, for then I will restore to the peoples a pure language, that they all may call on the name of the Lord to serve him with one accord. So this idea of calling on the name of the Lord, that was ingrained in Jewish history. They knew that concept of appealing to God for help, for salvation, and he promised to give it when people called upon him in earnest. And so here is Ananias saying, this is what calling upon the name of the Lord looks like. It's being baptized, and that's how you have your sins washed away. That's how you appeal to God for salvation. And I think we have to see that the same thing applies to us. This verse essentially makes forgiveness of sins and baptism inextricable from one another. You cannot take the washing away of sins out of baptism. This passage makes them linked and firmly linked. Well, Paul goes on to say in verse 17 that he was praying, and Jesus appears to him in a vision in that as he's praying. And again, he tells them where he was praying when Jesus came to him in this vision. And so I asked the question, where was he praying, and why was that detail important? Well, he says he was praying in the temple. Now, again, backing up, what did they heard? Well, this man is teaching Jews everywhere that they should cast off the law, and they should not circumcise their children and not observe the customs. If this man is a virulent or vicious anti-Semite's not the right word, but if he's viscerally against the law and against the temple and against the customs of the Jews, why is he going to the temple to pray? That's what you do in a temple that you respect, right? And that you hold in high regard, hold as holy. You pray there. And that's what Paul was doing. And furthermore, as Paul is praying in this temple that he reveres, Jesus speaks to him and demonstrates his approval for him, responds to that prayer that Paul is offering. And he's going to have some instruction for him. But I don't think that Paul throws this detail in for no reason. He is continuing to demonstrate, I have no animosity toward my people. I have no animosity toward this temple. I have no animosity toward the law under which I myself was brought up. Well, pardon me, Michael, as we move on, Jesus has some instructions for Paul. He tells him to flee Jerusalem. Why does he tell him that he's going to have to flee? And something I think is interesting here, Paul offers a counter argument. What is that argument that Paul offers?
So the answer is in verse 18. Jesus tells him to get up, go out of Jerusalem quickly, because they will not accept your testimony about me. And Paul's response to that kind of makes me hearken to think back to Abraham arguing with God or the angels about destruction of Sodom, in a way, just that confidence, if you will, to respond back to the one telling you to leave. He said in 19 through 21, I'm going to read there. And he said, the Lord, they themselves know that in the synagogue, in one synagogue after another, I imprisoned and beat those who believed in you. And when the blood of Stephen, your witness, was being shed, I myself was standing by and approving and watching over the garments of those who killed him. And he said to me, go, for I will send you far away to the Gentiles. And so you see Paul here wanting to kind of make things right, if you will. It seems to me with those that are at Jerusalem. He's in a way, I kind of see this as almost like a penance. Like he's got to tell them, these things that I have done were wrong. Mm-hmm. But Jesus there again insists to get out of the town.
Yep, I think you're spot on there. I think part of it is that he's wanting to tell them that he was wrong. He's wanting to try to make up for what he's done. And I wonder if another part of it too is to say, wait a second, they know who I was and what I did. Right. They know how zealously I pursued Christians before I myself became one. Surely they will give me a fair hearing when I want to present he's essentially going to bat for his people. Jesus says, they're not going to listen to you, Paul. Paul says, well, but I don't know. And then of course, as you point out, he says, no, they're still not going to listen. But here Paul is demonstrating that, look, I think I can reason with you, even though the Lord is telling me, I'm not going to get too far, Paul. And I like the way you brought up Abraham. This idea that we can somehow, you could use the word argue. It has a bad connotation. We can argue and not necessarily be disagreeable. And I think that's what Abraham was. I think that's what Paul's doing here. Maybe reason with is a better way of putting it. Mm-hmm. We have seen this, in fact, already in the book of Acts with Ananias himself. Jesus says, right. Listen, I want you to go look for this fella, Saul of Tarsus. He's staying at the house of a fellow named Judas, and Ananias says, Lord, I've heard about this guy. I'm not too sure about this. He's killing your people. And Jesus says, no, go ahead. Peter, if you recall, in the vision where the unclean things descended before him, and the Lord said, "Rise, Peter, kill and eat." Peter practically recoiled. "Oh, not so, Lord. I've never eaten anything unclean." So I think it's interesting that you have these men who have a good relationship with the Lord, do not feel as if they are stepping out of line to offer a reasoned argument when God gives them an instruction. That ought to give us great comfort when we pray to God. God, I don't understand what I'm supposed to do here, or this appears to be the right thing, but is it? I have this concern. Can you help me work through this concern? That really ought to give us great comfort. Now that is certainly in contrast with the kind of testing, tempting that Israel did with God in the wilderness. They were not on good terms with God. They were not interested in reasoning with God. They were just complaining. But these faithful men who were trying to serve the Lord, and they get instruction from him, and they don't understand why. God is very patient. Jesus is very patient with them, and reasons back with them. And that ought to give us, I think, great comfort.
One more point, if you don't mind, Brad.
Absolutely.
There.
Yeah, absolutely.
If you reach back a little bit to Acts 9, back where this actually happened, right? Mm-hmm. You get a glimpse a little bit into God's mind here as well. At the end of that, where Paul's taken out of the city in verse 30, and when the brothers learned this, they brought him down to Caesarea and sent him out by Tarsus. So the church throughout all of Judea and Galilee and Samaria had peace and was being built up, and walking in the fear of the Lord and in the comfort of the Holy Spirit, it multiplied. So somehow the time of Paul leaving the area ended up to the glory of God through the church growing and multiplying, which I mentioned a couple of weeks ago, but that's another theme that's underneath all of what's being said in Acts, is the church is growing by leaps and bounds through the book of Acts. And you see that over and over again. Yeah.
Good point. Excellent. Well, all right. Michael's brought us up to this point. Lance, the crowd's been patient with Paul. They've listened apparently with rapt attention up to this point, but Paul finally gives him something, the straw that breaks the camel's back. And what is that?
The word Gentiles. He is told to go, for I will send you far away to the Gentiles. And up to this point, the people, as you said, were listening rather intently probably to what Paul was saying. But as soon as it was said that he was going to be sent to the Gentiles to give them the way of the Lord, give them the word, as we've seen with lots of cases when Paul goes into a city and preaches the gospel, the Jews there feel like they were the only ones that were worthy of it and needed it or should have it, and nobody else outside the Jewish family should have it, and therefore they were very jealous and indignant about it. And at this point, they shut their ears, and that was the last thing that they wanted to hear, was that the word of God was going to be sent to the heathens or the Gentiles.
Now, as we've been making our way through Paul's speech, I didn't count, but we've had a number of points that Paul has used to build up his case. How many of those made any difference at this point, Lance? Which of those did the crowd consider and say, well, I don't know, maybe we need to give this guy another hearing?
No, their ears were shut once they heard the Gentiles statement. That was it. That was the last. That was the straw that broke the camel's back for them.
Yeah,
that shut them down.
Yeah, and I say that, I highlight that to say that when God brings judgment, it is not because he has not given us many chances. How many times had Paul himself, early on when he came to Jerusalem, we get the impression he was not there long, but he came to Jerusalem a few years after his conversion. and he tried to reason with the Jews there. All this time, the apostles have scarcely left Jerusalem. They have continued to maintain a presence there, and they have tried to reason with the Jews there over and over. Now, 25, going on 30 years on since the beginning of the church, Christians have been trying to, or had been trying to reason with Jews in Jerusalem and Judea to try to get them to come around. And obviously some did, but so many continued to reject that message. When God finally lowered the boom a few years later and destroyed that city in divine judgment, it was not because they had not been reasoned with many times. And every bit of the evidence that God had given, that the apostles had given, it just fell on deaf ears. They simply were not interested in what God was selling.
Yeah, one of the other point to make, you would think with being in Jerusalem and being brought up under the wing of Gamaliel, somebody that was very well known to the people there, they would have known who he was. And saying that, not making a difference with such an influential man, being the one that taught him, if that's not going to help, they were everything he was saying was falling on deaf ears.
Yeah. A sad picture, unfortunately. Well, if you remember, the reason that the commander had come down and tried to whisk Paul away was, number one, there was essentially a riot that had broken out, and there was a man, he didn't know who the fellow was, but he was being attacked, and so he figured he needed to come in and at least save him from being killed. But that kind of thing doesn't happen for no reason, right? Surely this fellow is guilty of something. And so all this time, he's completely in the dark. Remember, too, that Paul had spoken a word to him in Greek. But before that, he was asking, who is this fellow? What's he done? And one person was screaming this, another person was screaming that. He couldn't figure out what the facts were. When he gave Paul the opportunity to address the crowd, he still didn't learn anything, because Paul is speaking in a language to these people that this poor Roman commander doesn't understand. So he's been completely in the dark up to this point. Well, the things break down again, and he's just had it. So our last question here for this lesson, he wants Paul scourged. Why does he want to have Paul scourged? But then why did he very quickly change his mind about doing so? Well, as it says here in verse 24, the commander ordered him to be brought to the barracks and said that he should be examined under scourging so that he might know why they shouted so against. And in other words, what in the world is what could this guy possibly have done to cause such a ruckus? And this was Roman practice. If you were one of the conquered peoples under the Romans, if they wanted to know something from you, they would take you and they would give you a nice little whipping to sort of soften you up before they questioned you. They didn't want you putting up any fight. They wanted to completely break your will so that when they had questions, you would give up the answers. Well, the commander's men start to do this, of course, and Paul says, let me get the quote right. This is verse 25. Paul says, "Is it lawful for you to scourge a man who is a Roman and uncondemned?" And that stops them completely in their tracks. And Paul goes on to tell the commander, he says, "Listen, I'm a natural born Roman citizen." The commander himself had purchased his citizenship. Paul says, I was born with mine. And at that point, it didn't matter if the commander had ordered his men to beat Paul, they would not have done it, because if you were a Roman citizen, you were not, you could be in serious trouble if you beat a man before you convicted him of a crime. And that was what Paul was about to have to undergo, except that he made that fact known to his captors. So a good thing for Paul. I mean, if you recall from way back in chapter 9, when Jesus was telling Ananias, go and speak to Paul, he said, I'm going to show him how many things he'll have to suffer for my name. Well, Paul did suffer quite a bit, even up to this point. But we find that there are some things that Paul doesn't have to suffer. You don't just have to resign yourself to whatever suffering is coming your way. If I can appeal to the government to help me out, that's fine. And Paul played that card. He used it when he had an opportunity to, not in order to shirk his duty, but in this case, he did not have to endure that suffering. And certainly there's a lesson that we can take from that. It's not necessarily a badge of honor to endure suffering when God grants you a way of escape that is not shirking your duty. And so we shouldn't be ashamed to exercise our own rights if it is not in and of itself violating a commandment that God has given us. And on the occasions that the government will step in and protect us, will uphold those rights for us, well, then that government is doing what it's supposed to. There will be, I imagine, as it was with Paul, a number of times that it disappoints us, but when it's doing its job, it's doing what God put it in place to do. Well, we will go ahead and stop there. That brings us to the end of chapter 22. Again, one verse shy of the end of chapter 22. In the next lesson on Sunday, we will go into what happens next. Paul makes his defense. Again, the commander is still just trying to come to terms with, or not come to terms with it, just figure out what is going on here. And so he's going to have Paul give that defense before the Sanhedrin in this next chapter, and we'll see how that goes then. Well, Lance, Michael, thank you so very much for your help with the lesson this evening. And thank you all for watching. Hope it's been beneficial. Please feel free to contact us either through YouTube or through our website, pepperroadchurch.org. And if we can study the Bible with you, we'd love to have that opportunity. Thank you so very much. We hope to see you at the next class.